Hello, I'm Illah Nourbakhsh and welcome to my office. This video is going to be about demonstrating and introducing you to the GigaPan Epic and Epic 100 and the type of digital cameras that we find work really well with that equipment to take great panoramas. And what I have in front of me is an Epic 100. It's very similar to the Epic except that it's bigger dimensionally, so it's wider and taller. And it has a slot that moves, and I'll be showing you that, so that it can accommodate larger cameras. But for the most part, the menus are similar, and I'm going to stick with this for simplicity to introduce you to the system. Let's start by talking about the hardware itself. We call this the robot, and then you've got the digital camera, and altogether you have the GigaPan system. The reason we call this a robot is it has moving parts. And let me just go through those a little bit with you and explain it to you. First of all, what is important about the panorama process is you want to be able to take your camera and point it in multiple orientations, take pictures one at a time, and then later take all those overlapping pictures and put them together into one giant, very high-resolution image that's explorable. So this robot needs to be able to hold your camera and move it around. On the bottom, we have a stepper motor. This is called the pan motor. You'll notice actually that on the bottom of this robot there is a non-skid coating. That non-skid coating is nice because it means you can actually rest this on top of an object like a table or a railing in a museum and get pretty good shots even without a tripod. So that's the pan motor, and you can see that when the robot's off I can move it by hand. We have a tilt motor for the pitch of the camera, and that's right here. It's the same exact thing, and it also has a sort of non-slip surface on it. And I can move that by hand. It's not so easy on the Epic 100. You should be gentle with this. On the Epic, it has a lower gear ratio, and it's easier to move by hand because it's not designed for as heavy a camera. And the last motor we've got is a servo here, a servo motor, and that has a robotic finger attached to it. That's why this is a robot. So it can push down on the shutter to take pictures. And that's, of course, what makes this such a funny robot, since the only universal way we have of talking to inexpensive cameras is the shutter button. It makes a lot of sense to be able to push that down directly ourselves. So, a few more things about the robot. First of all, there is a level bubble here. That's very useful when you put this on a tripod to arrange and make sure that you're as level as possible so that your panorama comes out more or less straight. That's important. Another important point is a connection. The servo moves, and because it moves, we have to have this flexible cable here connecting it to the robot. If you were to unplug this, it's a cable that is just a 3-pin connector. And the trick with that is there's a big question, which is it's not necessarily obvious which way to plug it in. Now, the good news is if you plug it in wrong, when you turn the robot on, it says you've plugged in the cable wrong. So then you can try it the other way. The reason this is removable is because on the Epic 100, it's actually useful to be able to remove this and then plug in instead a remote trigger. And if you're using a camera like the G11 that we'll be talking about in a bit, you can actually unplug this, remove this unit altogether by unscrewing here. And you can put the G11 on here, you can get the cable from us that allows you to connect directly to the G11 from here. And then your robot will electronically tell the G11 to actually take the pictures. And so that works for the higher end point-and-shoot cameras that actually have remote triggers. Now, the other interesting thing to know about the system is, of course, the batteries. So let's talk about that. The batteries are in a compartment. Those of you who have used the old beta units see that this is quite different from that. Here we have a pretty easy way of taking the batteries in and out. They're just AA batteries. There's 6 of them. A few words about batteries. In general, I don't recommend that you use alkalines because they don't last very long. You're only going to get 3 or 4 panoramas out of alkalines, in my opinion. These are really nice high-energy nickel metal hydride batteries. These are 2600 milliamp hours each, and that's a pretty good battery to use. So you want to go for batteries that have a lot of amp hours on board, and you want to use nickel metal hydride and have a nickel metal hydride battery charger. That's the way to go. With batteries like these, I can easily take 10 really large GigaPan panoramas in the field before I need to change batteries. And when we get to the robot, you'll see it actually tells you how many volts you have running, so you have an idea when you're running low on battery power. You know what I do is I actually leave the batteries in my backpack inside of this case, but separate from the robot when I go hiking, so that there's no chance that the buttons are going to get hit as I hike around and turn the thing on. And often I'll get to the panoramic place, and then I'll actually put the batteries in for the shot. So that's one nice way to protect yourself. So we'll put the batteries in. and we've talked about the lower mechanism of the system. It's time to talk about one of the most important things of all, which is actually placing the camera on the robot. So I have 3 different cameras here that I want to just talk about briefly, and then we'll use one of the cameras to really go through all the menus with you. These 3 cameras happen to be Canons. Of course, you can use any make of camera on the GigaPan. And let's start with the smallest one, actually. This tiny camera that I have here is called it's in the SD series from Canon. This is the SD780 ELF. It's 12 megapixels. And it has, I think, a 3 times optical zoom. The reason this is a great choice is it's one of the smaller cameras from Canon that doesn't have too much vignetting, so it's reasonable that way. It has some zoom, it has pretty high quality optics, and you're able to do some of the most important things with this camera, even though it's a small point and shoot camera, which is, in this case, you can put it in what's called program mode on this camera, and then you can fix the exposure and the focus. And especially fixing the exposure turns out to be really important in GigaPans, because you want all the pictures that you take to have similar enough exposure that when you stitch them all together into one picture, the same sky doesn't look like it's different colors and different brightnesses, because that gets really, well, it gets ugly. So this is a small camera. This is in fact the camera that we use educationally. Now at the other end, if you have an Epic 100, it's a rather large unit, and it has this particular trick. The plate on which the camera sits actually comes out, and the dimensions of this area are quite large. And so you can put really large point-and-shoot cameras that are essentially nearly DSLRs on this. This is a nice example. This is a PowerShot SX10 IS. It's sort of the successor to the old SX100 series. And what's great about these cameras is they have a fantastic zoom. This has a 20 times optical zoom. In fact, 20 times optical zoom is so good that you'll often want to decide during your GigaPan shooting, do I really want to use full zoom, or is this 180-degree picture something where I only really need about half of my zoom? So whereas on the small ELF, you're always going to full zoom, it becomes natural and automatic to do that. On a camera like this, you're really going to make decisions about zoom. Because this is a Canon camera and is pretty high-end, the menus on it are nearly identical to the PowerShot G11. And so I'm going to use the G11, and I'll talk about why. And that menus that you see on there transfer extremely well to this, and actually also to the small PowerShot ELF, the SD780 that we talked about. So that's the really large camera, and indeed it fits on the Epic 100. Now, the camera that we're going to be talking about right now is the G11. This is one of my favorite cameras from Canon, and I like it because it's very compact. This is the best camera that we can recommend for the Epic. So the Epic 100 will fit this nearly DSLR version of the SX10 IS, but the Epic doesn't have this retractable plate, and it's actually a little bit smaller on the inside, which is great for hiking, but it does fit the Canon G11, which is an outstanding camera. And I think it reminds me of some of the old SLRs I used to use because it has these dials on top. So this is the camera we're going to use today, and I'm going to use this camera to show you how you go about mounting your camera on your robot. So first let me lock these side units because we don't need them to be extended for this camera. Now in putting the camera on the robot, the first thing to do is to realize that often there's some things you need access to before you lock your camera down. In particular, in the case of the G11, the SD card is down here and the battery is down here. I almost always use at least a 4 GB SD card, usually a 16 GB SD card. I highly recommend you use something nice and large, because you want to be able to take 400 or 500 pictures at the maximum resolution offered without even worrying about running out of memory. And of course, in this case, the battery is down here. And so between the battery of the camera and the batteries in the panorama, I can take something like 10 panoramas, and then it's time to change both batteries out. All right, let's go ahead and look at how to mount this on the robot. The first thing we do is notice that there's a 1/4 inch screw on the Epic 100. It's the same on the Epic, and it just slides left and right in the slot. That sliding is important because it lets us adjust the left-right position of the camera. We're going to take the regular 1/4 inch hole that you might use to mount your camera to a tripod, and instead of mounting to a tripod, we'll mount directly to here. I like to get the robot arm out of the way, and then I'll turn this so I have some room and I can see what I'm doing, and off we go.